Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Joan Carrigal, and I work in the Office of Student Affairs on the Student Life and Engagement team. On behalf of the entire Dean's Office, we are delighted to have you join us for this conversation on the financial and economic impact of COVID-19 with our esteemed faculty, Dean Emeritus Glenn Hubbard and Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Virtual events such as these are the beginning of many webinars to cover current topics with faculty, which will be hosted throughout the semester. As we do have limited time, I will place bios of our renowned speakers, including the moderator, in our chat function, should you like to learn more about the accomplishments and their background. We are excited to kick off today's session with our moderator, Anthony Villamagna, who outreached to Dean Emeritus Hubbard to initiate this session. Anthony Villamagna is Cluster Chair for A21 and Columbia University alum. And with that, I'm happy to introduce Anthony.
Thank you, Joan. Hey, everybody. My name is Anthony Villamagna. I know some of you. I'm a first-year MBA student and really happy that we could get this together and that we can come together as a community. Now, I do want to quickly go over some of the logistics for everybody who's watching. At around, we're going to start off with a discussion between Dean Hubbard and Professor Stiglitz, and then at about 12:50, we're going to begin the Q&A session. If you have a question, please write it into the Q&A box on your Zoom panel. We will not be able to answer any questions that are in the chat, so make sure you write it into that Q&A. Now, I do know that we're also going to be recording this, so if any of your friends or classmates, peers want to be watching this later, this will be posted either later tonight or tomorrow. I will make sure that that link gets out to everybody whenever that does finally go up. So I guess with no further ado, I know that the topic of our conversation obviously needs no introduction, just as the members of our panel need no introduction. So professors, would you like to start us off?
Welcome, everybody. This is obviously a very challenging time. It's also an interesting economic experience, obviously, to be going through. This pandemic is very different from a normal recession. I know we hear words like stimulus package and recession and unemployment like this is a typical recession. For those of you who saw numbers this morning, unemployment insurance claims went to 3.3 million. So that's new people filing for unemployment insurance benefits in a week. A number over 400,000 would mean a significant recession. So obviously a recession's in the offing. The question is, what does it look like? A pandemic is like a supply shock. So you would expect the pandemic to lead to shutdowns in an economy. That's certainly what we're living right now in New York. And during a shutdown, you've got essential activity for work, for commerce, for finance, basically closed. So the goal in a shutdown is to make sure you mimic a normally functioning economy as much as you can. So the goal is not to stimulate people to go out and do things. There's nothing really much to do, but to keep people attached to work. And partly what policymakers should seek to avoid is what I would think of as an aggregate demand doom loop. We can't stop the pandemic and the shutdown in the economy. That's necessary. I'll come back to that. But we can stop a doom loop from mass layoffs and from a lot of business closures. How do you do that? One, you'd want to help states with health infrastructure and their healthcare programs like Medicaid. Two, you'd want to help individuals. You've seen programs like getting checks mailed to low and moderate income individuals. But most importantly, you want to try to keep people attached to work. Because again, you hope you flip the light switch back on relatively soon. The way to do that would be large-scale lending programs to big business. You see that in the recovery bill the Congress is passing. And importantly, you need to focus on small and mid-sized businesses. Those are the businesses with essentially poor balance sheets, no access to credit, who are laying off most of the people. The way to do that would be to essentially fill in that aggregate demand, give them money. Mechanically, that would be through a loan from a bank. That's the entity with whom they have a relationship. and then forgive that loan if they keep their workers in place. That is what the congressional bill tries to do. If we get policy done right, we could have what economists would call a V-shaped recession and recovery, a steep downturn and then a steep upturn. If we get policy wrong, we're in trouble. Let me just wind up with a mentioning of two curves that I think will help everybody think about this. One is the pandemic itself. So think of an infection curve that has a first and second derivative. And obviously in that curve, you want to push it down as fast as possible. The problem is, as you do that, another curve, the economic cost curve, becomes steeper. So the flatter you're making the pandemic curve in real time, the steeper the economic cost. That's the trade-off. It is not wise to act on arbitrary dates to get people back to work. The thing is that we need information about infection rates and recovery rates to be able to do that. I will say it's just a matter of simple statistics, and then I'll wrap up. What we hear about infection rates and death rates aren't really that informative at the moment because the denominator isn't clear. The denominator is based on people who are testing who are often quite ill to begin with. We really need to move to a regime of random sampling if we want to learn more. The quicker we can get better testing, the more progress we make on the pandemic, and that will help us on the economic front. So I'm sure much more to talk about, but those would be my opening thoughts. Thanks, Anthony.
Let me say first that I agree with everything that Glenn said. I would say that as we prioritize, there are three issues: health, protecting the vulnerable, and restarting the economy. On the first, on our health, there are a couple of things that have been of concern to me that left off of the agenda. We want everybody who is sick not to show up at work. And that means we need paid sick leave. And there was almost a cynical act of Congress when it said they had a paid sick leave provision, and 80% were exempted. That was really, I think, foolish. The other thing is we want, undocumented workers can spread the disease just as well as documented workers, and it's important that they not be turned over to ICE. And we haven't made the kind of commitment not to do that that we should. The congressional bill is providing important help for hospitals, but at the front line of support for our health are the states. And they're going to be devastated by not only the increased cost of providing healthcare, but also by the plummeting revenues. And there is inadequate assistance for the states in the congressional bill. Governor Cuomo has made that very clear. And finally, it is really striking that the United States, supposedly the richest country in the world, has been totally incapable of providing the tests, protective gear, the masks, the ventilators that are necessary. South Korea was able to gear up its mass production with even less warning than the United States. So in terms of the response, this first pillar, which is the most important, has really been a disappointment in the United States. The second pillar is protecting the most vulnerable. And here, I think what the United States has done, after a lot of pushing, including some work that Glenn did, has done, I think, an impressive job. I think one shouldn't underestimate some of the administrative problems, particularly of sending checks, and particularly to the poorest of Americans. And the contrast between the original statement that checks would be out in 2 weeks, now it's 3 weeks for those who have appropriate information with the IRS, and many more weeks for those that don't, is again very disappointing. You know, the contrast with what Argentina has done, where on Tuesday they said they were going to get money to children who, and every child, and on Friday of the same week, they had already they delivered. I mean, really contrast between what these countries can do and what we've been able to do. Now, there, in terms of where we will be to pick up the V shape that Glenn talked about, one of the concerns that was brought out in the 2008 crisis is balance sheets. What would balance sheets be looking like, household and firm? And here I worry that with so many Americans having so many credit card debts, student debts, some of the credit card debts, the effective interest well in excess of 30%. Even a short period of time with all the fees, late charges, their debts will mount. And so while it's been good that there's been a stay on evictions and foreclosures on federally insured property, it needs to be much more widespread and include a stay on interest on credit card debt and student loans. The third pillar is making sure that business can restart when we recover. And here we don't want a loss of organizational and informational capital as a result of a large number of bankruptcies. Again, I think what seems to be emerging is much better than what went in. There is some kinds of accountability. There's a lack of prioritization that one would have hoped. There is a lack of assuredness that the taxpayer will be adequately compensated for the risks that they're bearing, especially given the tax cut of December 2017, which instead of going for investment led to almost $1 trillion of share buybacks. And many of the companies, including some of the airlines, are in the position that they are is because they didn't manage the risk well. And if they had not distributed so much money in share buybacks, they would be in much better financial position. So I think it's imperative that there not be gifts to these companies, but that there be loans with adequate upside potential to compensate for the downside risk. So that's the broader perspective. I think I might mention one more thing, which is this is a pandemic, it's a global crisis, and the United States is in good fortunate that it can go ahead and have a $2 trillion program. The developing countries and emerging markets are not in such a lucky place. And the G20 is meeting today. My understanding is that they'll make a commitment to use all instruments that are possible. A very important instrument is the SDRs, the special drawing rights. What is needed about a $500 billion special issuance, and that would provide a lot of assistance. And of course, they'll need a lot of help in the healthcare sectors.
Yeah, can I add to that, Anthony? Or?
Yeah, of course, of course.
I agree with what Joe said. I think it's important to draw a distinction between the 2008, the great financial crisis, and today, because the great financial crisis had a lot of actors with particular behavior patterns that precipitated the crisis. This is, generally speaking, I mean, Joe gave some counterexamples, but generally speaking, you should think of this one as much closer to a pure act of God. The question is how we handle it, not whether we might have been able to do something else. So in that sense, while in 2008, you heard a lot about moral hazard, you heard a lot about being very careful. I think here, especially to get out in front of an aggregate demand doom loop, as crazy as it sounds, you want to be almost less discriminating, not more discriminating, to stop the aggregate demand doom loop. I completely agree with what Joe said about states, and I would add something to it. As we're dumping more people, unfortunately, onto unemployment insurance rolls, remember that states in the United States play a large role both in processing unemployment insurance and paying for it. They're simply not set up to cover mass unemployment. So it's really important to see people stay with their jobs, which is why I think the congressional bill is so good. The administrative points Joe raises are also super important. We don't often talk about them. Getting checks out to people is not so easy. In 2001, when I was in the White House, it took us a while, once the president and the Congress had made a decision to get checks, to get it done. What I've been trying to work on with Treasury is to use payroll processing companies. So I happen to sit on the board of ADP. We're the largest of those companies, but we know how to pay people. That's what we do for a living. And so I think that the payroll processing companies could be a big resource for the IRS. The other issue is on the small business and mid-sized business loans. It's really important to communicate to businesses that those are available. Those are loans, but they would be forgiven if businesses keep their workers on staff. Somebody needs to get that simple message out. The administration's not as effective at the moment in communicating as I might like. The final thing I would say is on next steps. This bill, as large as it is not a stimulus bill. It really is a freeze frame, let's get the economy back to normal. You're going to see other bills, and I think it'll be very important to get the economics and the politics right. Two areas of coordination I think are going to be ripe. One, I think you're going to hear more in the coming year or so about Treasury Fed coordination than you've heard about probably since the Second World War. How to do that and preserve central bank independence is super important. The other is international coordination and cooperation. Just before the crisis took full force here, I had returned from India for 2 weeks, wonderful trip. But of course, India is now on lockdown without the public health and financial resources of the United States. So the US has to be careful and vigilant and leading there. And I think Joe's proposal for an SDR expansion from the IMF is a good idea. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, perfect. So I know that one of the questions that has been on the mind of a lot of people, and it's been a part of like popular discussion right now, is that people are talking about that the cure is worse than the illness, so to speak, economically. So how do you two value that assessment, I guess, both as human beings and as economists?
Well, maybe let me begin by saying, since I'm in the elderly group that will be sacrificed if we took the other approach, I feel perhaps more sensitive on that issue. But let me look at it in a couple of different ways. First, it's a false choice. The idea that people will go back to work when they're afraid that they'll start flying while the disease is rampaging through the country, that they go to restaurants, go to movie theaters while the disease is rampaging through the country is an absolute nonsense. So the reality is that there will be a major economic slowdown whether we have a lockdown or not. And the real question is, how do we manage the best over the next 2, 4, 6 months? And I think all the indications are that the best way to do it is the way that we are doing it in New York, which is to social distancing, shutting down anything that is not an absolute necessity, and hoping for as close to a V-shaped recovery as we can. That makes the most sense. If you did it in a very narrow cost-benefit analysis, it would depend on how you value life. But if you use the kinds of numbers that we typically use for cost-benefit analysis, and you take seriously the kinds of numbers of likely deaths if we simply went ahead, plunged ahead, the value of the lost lives is equal to more than a year's GDP. So that it would really be penny wise and pound foolish to go forward with the kind of opening up the economy at Easter that has been proposed. I think that's utter nonsense.
Okay, it seems like we're having some trouble getting. Oh, there we
Okay,
go.
okay. Now the host had muted me again. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I agree with Joe. Going back to what I said about the pandemic curve versus the macro curve, it's very important to flatten both the first and second derivatives of the pandemic curve. And I think if you think about the US as a nation rather than just New York City in isolation, it may be that there are pockets of population where more mobility can be allowed faster than others. But certainly New York is not one of those areas for now. I'm certainly not a physician or an epidemiologist, but I'd be very surprised to see this current phase ended by Easter time, as wonderful as that might be, likely a few weeks later, and then a gradual reopening of the economy, which is why most of the recovery packages that are being contemplated are looking at an 8 to 12 week period, not just a week or two. And it's not about whether social distancing caused it or Governor Cuomo caused it. I don't think that's fair. I think it really is the pandemic, and state and local leaders are doing the best they can to respond to that. Will they get everything right? Probably not. None of us does. But I think it's a very good response. And you shouldn't think about the economy curve somehow as being something that we want independent of the health curve. We need to get them both right.
And can I add one more thing to that, which is the way the curve grows, it's exponential. So the fact that you see very little incidence of the disease now shouldn't give you a lot of comfort. That was the mistake we made 2 months ago. And if we had taken action earlier on, we would have been better in curbing it. And South Korea has shown that you can do it if you have really strong testing and tracing. We don't have the test and we don't have the tracing capacities in place. It would be great if we could rush and get those, and that would obviously mitigate the magnitude of the economic consequences. We have other instruments, but we've not been deploying those other instruments.
Okay, so professors, I know that you've touched on a little bit briefly on the $2 trillion stimulus package that was passed, although Professor Hubbard, you said it wasn't exactly a stimulus package. Can you talk about, from your point of view, whether you believe that this action in its scope is going to be sufficient in order to make a real dent in the slump in demand that we're seeing right now and the economic sagging that we're seeing at the moment?
I think it will definitely make a big dent in it, particularly in keeping people attached to work. The speed with which it's implemented is going to be very, very important. But as large as the number 2 trillion is, I don't think that's enough to truly defeat this crisis. So I think you'll see the Congress coming back, but is this the right way to get the economy back on footing? I think it's an excellent start.
Yeah, let me make 2 comments. One, echoing what Glenn said earlier, we always worry about 2 types of errors, type 1 and type 2. Getting money to people who don't need it or not getting money to people who need it. And Glenn was absolutely right. The issue of moral hazard is not the central issue here. The issue is really getting money to everybody that needs it. Secondly, the key issue right now is not lack of aggregate demand. It will eventually play in, nor is it financial meltdown. The key issue here is the disease. That's the underlying problem. But if we don't adequately address the disease, there will be a financial meltdown. People won't be able to pay their debts. Debts will build up, and there will be cascades of bankruptcies that will put our whole economy in paralysis of the kind that we saw in the breakdown of the Soviet Union and in the East Asia crisis, where 50 to 70% of the firms went into default. So I think what your way to think about this is preventing a disaster and enabling us to recover better when the pandemic is put under control. But Glenn is absolutely right that it is very likely that we will need additional measures. We can't say what those are because we don't know how long this is going to be, and we don't know how deep the downturn is going to be. The numbers came out today on the unemployment, new unemployment applications. But from what I've heard, there are many people who couldn't get through to the unemployment offices. This goes to the issue of capacity. And so they're not registered as unemployed yet, but they got up at 4:30 in the morning to do it, and they couldn't get on. So it's a serious problem, and we really will have to monitor it as it goes along.
Okay, and I guess the follow up to that is that obviously we have a $2 trillion stimulus packages, and
don't call it a stimulus package. It's a stimulus package suggests that it's a problem of aggregate demand. It's a total recovery focusing on healthcare, on helping the most vulnerable, and putting us in a position to recover when the time for recovery comes. I'm sorry, I don't like the word stimulus because
I agree. I agree.
Please excuse my simplification then of the term. That's what I'm used to since I graduated high school whenever in 2009. So that's what I'm used to. But I guess the follow up to that is that obviously it's quite a large spending bill, as I guess I can call it. Is there going to be any potential ramifications for the national debt on the economy of having a bill of that size?
Well, sure. I mean, there's no free lunch. The U.S. can certainly tolerate more debt than it had pre-crisis, but it can't tolerate an infinite amount of debt. We know we already have problems in our entitlement program, Social Security and Medicare program debt, which isn't even on the balance sheet. But just as one fights a war and then services debt, that too should be the attitude here. We need to get past this. But then, yes, on a clear day, the U.S. would need to look at some package of revenue or spending measures to accommodate that. No free lunch.
Now, Glenn is absolutely right. One way of thinking about it is we are poorer. We will have lost a significant amount of production, and we've taken on some more debt. And so both sides of the balance sheet, the liabilities are up and assets are down in a fundamental sense. And that means we have to recalibrate. But we are not in any sense in a crisis. Our debt GDP ratio at the end of World War II was 135%. And I think Glenn's analogy, you go fight a war, you do what it takes, and then you figure out afterwards. And the years after World War II were our fastest rate of growth because we managed that, I think, very well. We went ahead and had the National Highway Program, education program, research program. We did a lot of things to make our country stronger. So there'll have to be a national conversation about revenue generation and expenditure curtailment. What are the priorities? Glenn and I may not always agree on what all those priorities will be, but I think we can agree that we will have to revisit all those questions again.
Okay, and I suppose that we have a number of fans of Andrew Yang in the audience today, and they'd like to know if the universal basic income would help, I guess, the economy at a time like this. Would that stave off any of the ramifications of on the economy from COVID-19?
I don't think so. I mean, it is true that that idea has gotten some press because we will be mailing some checks to individuals, but that may have more to do with Mitt Romney than Andrew Yang. I think the problem with the universal basic income model is that it divorces income from work. And the goal ought to be to keep people in the productive economy. So ideas like wage subsidies, ideas like the ones we're talking about today in the US context, the earned income tax credit, all of those sound much better to me than universal basic income. So I hope very much it's not an idea whose time has come.
So let me add a couple points to that, which is, first I agree, work is important. That this is a response to an emergency, and the administrative tasks of using universal basic income as an emergency measure when we don't have it in place are enormous. And that's why I actually commend the what came out of the congressional package, because it kept the connections with work. It reduced the burden on sending out checks. It used existing universal unemployment insurance schemes, and most importantly, employer keeping people on payrolls. I think that was an important part of it. So at this particular, as a crisis response, I think the diversified approach that we took was the right one. And whether universal basic income is a good answer in the long run is a broader issue, and for reasons that Glenn mentioned, I think it is not the right issue, and I think we ought to be focusing on other aspects of really making sure that everybody who is able and willing to work can, and that people have the skills to be productive members of our society.
Okay, so I know that we've been focusing a lot specifically here in the U.S., but there are a number of questions about what are going to be the ramifications globally for this. And so, as firms are seeing these shocks to their supplies, do you think that that there's going to be any sort of pullback on globalization, that firms will begin to try to keep more operations within their home country within their base? Do you think that we're going to see that at all?
Yeah, I think this is an increase in transactions cost. That was my first worry when I heard about COVID-19, not knowing how bad it would be in the US, was that it would disrupt supply chains and make ideas of very complicated global supply chains and just-in-time inventory more quaint, perhaps, than they had been in the past. At the same time, I just find it hard to believe that globalization is going to win. We are integrated in many respects around the world. I don't think we can ignore that. So I think it will change business organization, but I don't see it as a death knell to globalization.
Yeah, let me just add that I think the real problem is not globalization, but two others. One, we ran too taut of a ship. We didn't have the spare tire in our car. Just-in-time inventory production has a lot of virtues, but it means that you're more vulnerable to a perturbation of the kind that we've had. And I think the issue of resilience will get a lot more attention going forward. And the second thing is, you might call it diversification, that in many sectors, there were 1, 2, 3 suppliers And if a key supplier got interrupted, the whole production chain got interrupted. And we just assumed that those kinds of things didn't happen. But now we realize they do happen, and that was always clear that they could have happened. And I've always been worried about that kind of lack of diversification. What has been happening, not just now, but in the last couple of years, is a reminder that borders still matter. We still, the unit of analysis, the unit of politics is the nation state. And I think there will be a greater concern that we have a broader set of capabilities at home than in the era when globalization really dominated. But Glenn is absolutely right. We are too integrated to abandon globalization.
Okay, perfect. And Professor Stiglitz, I do know that it's 1 o'clock, and I believe
Yes,
that
I have to go teach.
you have a class to teach. So, everybody, please join me in thanking Professor Stiglitz for his time, and we'll be continuing on for the next half hour with Dean Hubbard. And so, Dean Hubbard. Oh, there we go. So, Dean Hubbard, if you somebody wants to know about the oil shock and the crashing oil prices, and whether that's is this a subplot to what's happening in the economy, or is this actually a main story? And what are your thoughts around that?
It's a subplot, but it's an important one. It reflects a couple of things. Obviously, a weak economy lowering oil prices, but the conflict between Russia and Saudi Arabia in oil market control. The U.S. traditionally, if you went back, say, a decade or more ago, the fall in oil prices would have been good news. It's still good news in terms of consumers, but it definitely is bad news in terms of business investment, and the bad news will dominate in the short run. You're also seeing a feedback effect because some oil producers, oil drillers, and even majors are having credit downgrades, which obviously has effects on some institutional investors as well. So oil is definitely a story here.
Okay, perfect. And so, as we still think about that global picture, the global economy, you have a lot of countries that their economy are perhaps not as stable or as robust as the United States in Latin America or in Africa. What do you think is going to be the impact to those countries, those emerging markets, long term after a 30-day or a 60-day quarantine, whatever it might be?
Well, two things. One is on health, and the other on the economy. On health, in some economies, Mexico and Brazil come to mind, you aren't seeing universal social distancing and other policies that are being highly recommended, and so you might see more of a spike in incidence. The other is the economic cost. It is harder for some emerging market economies to bear that cost, and it may also affect their ability to service debts. So I think there will be a very serious role for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to play after we get out of the heat of battle of the healthcare crisis to help these emerging economies cope.
So, as a lot of people have talked about this, at least extending in through May, potentially through the end of the summer. But what I'm really curious in is if we see COVID-19 becoming a recurring illness, let's say seasonal, and it comes back before we have a vaccine yet, what do you think is going to be the impact there?
Well, it's a great question. Of course, nobody really knows, but I think we will see a lot of progress on testing ability and hopefully even progress toward a vaccine by the next winter season. What we don't know, I've seen stories on either side of this, is the extent to which warmer weather will necessarily be our friend. Normally with influenza it is. We don't 100% know here. So we might get the benefit of warmer weather and then worry about it next winter. But to the extent that it repeats or other influenza streams repeat, then we're going to need to focus on testing, vaccination, and being prepared. I might say that it's a little disturbing to me that we weren't more prepared at a government level. I've personally been through a number of pandemic war games in government and quasi-government sources. These studies happen all the time, and yet we seem to have been caught flat-footed.
So I know that the situation in China it seems to have more or less stabilized. I know that my sister lives in Tianjin right now. That's what she's telling me. But do you think that the Chinese economy at this point in time is positioned to perhaps overtake the U.S. because they seem to have things under control right now? And how do you view the U.S. versus China, like power and prestige, as a result of the outcomes from COVID-19?
A great question. China, I think, has restarted. Every firm with which I work, has seen Chinese production and Chinese commerce starting to come back. So China started ahead of us on the downside and is ahead of us on the upside. I don't think that means anything like China overtaking the United States. I mean, if I were to bet on a country's long-term future, it would still be the United States with all of its drawbacks. I think for China, there's even a concern about the way the government handled the crisis, about whether the party was up to it. So I think actually quite the opposite. But it is clear that China's strategy for the health crisis of a very sharp lockdown was very effective from a health policy perspective.
Okay, so do you think that this current crisis is going to have any long-term impact on how consumers in the U.S. and abroad act in any sort of way?
I think it will. Not that I think that the current malaise we have is going to be there forever, but I think it will in the following sense. We're doing this on Zoom now, and a lot of students are using Zoom now. My son is a student at another business school. He's using Zoom. My other son is in high school using Zoom. So I think the idea about mobile communication is important. I think the fact that so many businesses have pivoted to that may change business travel habits and meeting habits. Whether social things change, like handshaking versus namaste or social distancing, I don't know. But every major episode that we have seen has changed behavior in some ways, whether it's making people risk averse or socially different. I think we're going to see a lot of discussion of that once the heat of battle settles down.
Can you please try and put in perspective for all of us I guess what's happened in the stock market, particularly this week as a reaction to the government spending bill that was passed into the actions of the Federal Reserve? Do you think that this is a sort of a sustainable rally in the stock market? And if you can give us your thoughts around that, that would be great.
Well, if I really knew what was going to happen in the market, I'd keep it to myself and be a hedge fund billionaire. But I'll say how an economist might think about it. The market shrugged its shoulders at the original coronavirus impact. And I remember that Zanny Mitten-Beddoes, who's the editor of The Economist, and I were guests on the Wall Street Week program that week. It may have been late January, early February. And we both said, this is a mistake. I mean, the market should be going down. We were focused more on transactions costs, the pure supply shock effect of it, not thinking about how bad the demand effect would be. Having said that, it seems to me the market has overreacted. If I were to estimate what I think this does to long-term growth prospects, which dominate the values for most stocks, I think the market reaction seems extreme. Part of that is a disruption in liquidity in markets. That's why the Fed has tried to intervene in ways that it has. But I think that, obviously individual stocks will do what they do, but the market as a whole, I think, will do better once the stimulus package or recovery package takes effect, and once there's a clearer path on the shape of the health problem. For students, I would commend to your reading. I saw my colleague Tano Santos did an excellent section on coronavirus, probably in his value investing class, but he walks through at a very good level just going from simple Gordon growth model math into what you need to believe for the current stock market reaction to be rational. I definitely commend it to anybody.
So there's also been some discussion about potential bailouts within either the airline industry or the cruise ship industry. And do you think that this is a thing that the government should be exploring? And then on top of that, what lessons do you think that we as the United States should have learned from the financial crisis 10 years ago about bailouts?
What's interesting is, as I said, the crisis 10 years ago is different because a lot of the firms that were bailed out had behavior patterns before the bailout that make you wonder. And so that was the need for oversight. Here, more or less, that's not true. The pandemic came out of nowhere. It wasn't caused by moral hazard. Yet, I would put into two different buckets. The small and mid-sized businesses, I would say, be indiscriminate, make the mass forgivable loans, try to keep people connected to work. With large businesses, I think you do need more oversight. If I take the question you literally asked about airlines, so the reason I care a lot about airlines is mainly the movement of cargo makes them an essential facility. Yes, they also do passenger travel, of course, but I think cargo is probably their best hook if I were trying to make the argument for federal assistance. So I do think they deserve some. Cruise ships, I'm not sure I would be as eager to do if it were me, but certainly the airlines have a reasonable claim. For other affected industries, I think you'd want general loan programs. After 9/11, I remember we did that for airlines, hotels. There was a big disruption in travel and tourism, as people may remember. So I think that's reasonable. I think you want to be very careful about doing things industry by industry.
So I know that you just said that you want to be careful about doing things industry by industry, but do you think that there should be perhaps a specific focus on geographic region within the United States on what areas need to be relieved more than others, or should it be just universal for everyone?
I think the geographic focus ought to be more in block grants on the pure health front. So some states and regions may need more assistance from the federal government, both on public health infrastructure, the ventilator fight, for example, here in New York City, or in support for their Medicaid programs. I think the other get people back to work packages, are fine as is. As long as you keep people employed, I think that will work. But different states will need more help on the healthcare front, and hopefully policymakers can be prepared to do that.
Perfect. So I guess I'm going to ask a question that I know is on the minds of a lot of CBS students right now. And obviously, there's a lot of people out there who are worried about how this crisis can impact hiring for graduations in May. And how exactly do you see companies responding just through the lens of hiring over the next few months?
Well, it's a great question. And I do not think companies suddenly wake up and say, we don't need more talent. Every year, top business school students are in heavy demand by the best companies. That is not going to change this year. In fact, I think if I had a worry, it might be for younger alumni, even more than current students. Companies never want to miss their slots in current MBA students. I think the issues there are going to be two. One, companies like our discussion here today are thinking about, when does the healthcare crisis really attenuate? When is it actually safe for me to think about bringing on and mainstreaming new employees? And then second, of course, what's the economic recovery look like? To the extent that there is this V-shaped pattern, and I see every reason to believe there is, I would expect to see a very good recovery in the new employee job market fairly fast being determined by the healthcare parts of us, which none of us know. A slower recovery in demand will slow that down, but top talent are still top talent. That would at least be my view.
So obviously, Colombia is located in the epicenter of the outbreak here in the U.S. And so, do you believe that CBS is going to be disproportionately affected when compared to other business schools in terms of career prospects at the moment?
I don't, because by the time the job matches are made, this crisis is hopefully behind us, unless I severely misunderstand the healthcare aspects of this. So I think it's more a matter of the healthcare crisis itself and whether the recession that emerges is this V-shaped pattern or something more sinister. I think that's really the issue. Whether you went to Columbia or Harvard or Stanford or whatever business school, I don't think is going to be as much of an impact.
And obviously I guess there have been some questions that have been sent in about one of the big value prospects of an MBA, of coming back to business graduate school, is the networks that you're able to build with people.
Yep.
And the connections that you're able to make, both with your peers and with faculty. So obviously being through Zoom makes that prospect a little bit more challenging, a little bit more difficult. So how would you see that reflected in the value of an MBA? Do you think that it's been damaged in any way by the virus?
I don't, although I can't deny that for those of you who are second-year students, your last semester is probably not what you'd hoped. And for first-year students, your last bit of your first year is not what you'd hoped. That's doubtless true. But I think what Zoom has taught us is that maybe some of the basics in an MBA program, the basic instruction, could be done online so that you could spend the time when you're in class with a talented faculty member and talented fellow students on more discussion, on more interaction, on more casework. So in that sense, I think it's an enabler more than it hurts. To me, the value of going to any of the handful of very top global business schools is the physical interaction. I think you learn so much more from being close to great faculty, great fellow students, great speakers in class. I don't think that will go away. But I do think we've learned that it's easier to pivot than we think to using online tools, and that those can be helpful in basic skills or can be helpful, for example, in the executive MBA program. For a long time, students have used this as communication devices in between classes. So I don't see it as either or, but both and.
So from your perspective, and last question on this, what would you say to students who are feeling isolated from the Columbia community, both obviously physically and then just in their connection with their peers?
Well, it's a huge question, and we're all feeling that, and it's an absolutely reasonable and normal thing to feel at a time like this. Speaking for myself, I use Zoom a lot personally, as well as professionally, talking to friends. My wife and I will talk to other couples by Zoom. A McKinsey partner the other day told me about a global McKinsey Zoom cocktail party. I haven't done one of those, but I suppose anything is possible. Taking care of yourself, remembering to exercise and things like that are also a critical component of mental health. But these feelings are not abnormal. And it's really important just to focus one day at a time, getting through your tasks, monitoring but not obsessing on the news, and keep yourself healthy.
You were obviously dean at CBS during the financial crisis. And so from your perspective, what was it that the students did back then that was perhaps in your eyes the most valuable and important thing for the students to come together and to be able to continue to have that community during a time of such adversity?
It's a great question. And actually what we're doing now is a key example of that. During the crisis, we had so many times to get students together, faculty together, alumni together, staff together to talk about what the crisis was. Then as now, we have a lot of faculty who are working on elements of this. What might be done about it? What might be the effects on MBA students? How should staff think about this for their future, and faculty? Those conversations are important. Now in 08 and 09, we could do it physically. We could all pile into US 301 or whatever. Here we're doing it virtually, but I think reassembling as a community, airing what's important to us, showing support for each other and talking about it remains important. That would at least be my view.
So, I guess it's perhaps been said that whenever a population, specifically young people, go through a financial crisis, any sort of economic recession like this, that it impacts them moving forward. And so in your idealized world, like how would we as future business leaders be able to take the lessons from right now and moving it forward into our own careers? Like what can we do to proactively work against towards safeguarding our own companies in the future?
It's a great question. And I've been going through this on boards where I serve and director networks too. And I give two answers. One is preparation. While none of us could have literally predicted a COVID-19 crisis at this point in time, the idea of a pandemic is definitely something to be prepared for. As I said, government has been over this before. In companies I'm involved with, we've done tabletop exercises on this. One company so well, we're managing through the crisis quite easily. So I think that's really critical. The other is resilience, which is something Joe said. I know we all believe we want to get things just right or literally optimized. The truth is you want a resilient structure. And for that, you also need resilient leaders who are able to be knocked around to their left or right, as any of us is in our personal lives or professional lives, and be able to lead men and women even when you're knocked around like that. So I think preparation and resilience are super important. And I know we all think, let's just focus on what's important now. Let's optimize as quickly as we can. That's a good advice for a perfect world, but we don't live in a perfect world. And I think preparation and resilience are absolutely key. And I wouldn't be surprised to see more focus on those in business education after this.
So I know that you were at one point being considered for Fed chairman, and so you take a look at the actions that have been, I guess, that have been taken by the Fed during this crisis. Do you feel that they are appropriate and sufficient? And if you would change anything, what would you change?
Well, I'm the chairman of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation. So on our website, you can see two statements we put out in the past couple of weeks, both of which the Fed did react to, I'm pleased to say. The Fed was very late to a party of expanding its authority. Not to get too much in the weed, but Section 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act does limit what the Fed can do in crisis lending. The Dodd-Frank law, I think, wrongly trimmed the Fed's sails. So several of us have called for expanded programs. Those have happened, but the Fed is not a savior. What the Fed can do is make liquidity better. It can make markets work better, particularly for large firms, but it can't really make transfers, which is what you need to do in a crisis. That's the Treasury. So I know in a period where we think our politics are dysfunctional, we turn to the Fed to do more and more and more, but the Fed really can't do everything. So I think the Fed got there more slowly than I and maybe some others would have liked, but it has gotten there. And finally, the government is too.
Now, I know that you said that the Fed isn't a savior, but there have been a ton of questions about the Fed. And so people would love to hear your opinion on, as the Federal Reserve takes on more and more corporate bonds and loans, and perhaps takes on more and more risky debts out there. Do you think that could have any potential negative implications on the way that the Federal Reserve is able to run in the future?
I worry about that. I mean, the Fed, if you take risk, well, let me step back. I'm not worried out of an accounting sense. I know some people like to count what they think the Fed's capital is. It doesn't matter if the Fed has any capital or not. The true balance sheet here is the Treasury. It's the nation's balance sheet. The Fed is just a fiction that Congress created and called a central bank. So I'm not worried for that reason. But I am worried that when we intervene with public policy in ways that lead to losses, our elected officials need to decide that, just the way they decide other subsidy spending and tax programs. I wouldn't want unelected officials making those decisions, and that's also not what the Constitution contemplates. So I worry when the Fed makes risky loans. Now, sometimes it has to get in that business. It's a crisis and the Treasury's not acting, refusing to act, unable to act, whatever. But I do think it's a concern. And central bank independence is important. In the present crisis, the Fed's intervention in commercial paper, I think, is fine. I think buying investment-grade corporate bonds is fine. I think buying mortgage-backed securities to ensure normal market functioning and spreads is fine. Even on the small business loans, the way it's envisioned in the legislation is that the Treasury is going to guarantee those loans. And so at that point, I would have no trouble with the Fed buying them as well. But I would have trouble if the Fed slipped into effectively credit allocation, because I think Congress needs to do that, even if Congress is not functioning as well as many of us might hope.
Do you believe that the Fed should be able to set negative interest rates, and would that do anything either right now or during any other future crisis that we might see?
Well, the Fed, I mean, interest rates more or less are going to be set by supply and demand, and the Fed will move that a bit, but it's really market forces. I don't think negative interest rates as a policy matter are a good idea. I do not think they have helped where they have occurred. And I think that what they have done is largely lay bare the fact that fiscal policy could have done more. You know, before the crisis hit several weeks ago, I was trying to talk with members of Congress about the need for a bolder infrastructure program for the United States, not because I was thinking of new projects or stimulus or anything like that, but something that would bolster confidence about long-term demand. I think Europe needs that. I think the United States needs that. I think that's going to be more important. I don't think negative interest rates are going to bail out this economy or any economy.
Right, so I guess shifting back to I guess to the CBS student right now is you know, obviously mental health has been at the forefront of the news, and it's been a big focus of emphasis over the last decade or so. And so how do you see this current crisis as being something that could perhaps exacerbate those mental health problems, or as being something that could be negatively impact the student population from that way? And what can we do as a community to help those who need to be supported at this time?
Well, it's a great question. Anthony, I would put it in two buckets. One is about worry. Any normal person right now would be worried. You'd be worried if you're a student about the job market. You might be worried about a student loan. People might be worried about their savings, about their family. Those are all completely normal, as well as just worrying, am I going to get sick? I mean, these are all perfectly normal worries. And like all worries, you know, they have to be put in the here and now and given their appropriate place. The more dangerous thing is to let those fester in isolation. I think it's very important not to be isolated from a community now, even if by necessity you're more isolated from friends or colleagues physically than you might want to be. So things like the old-fashioned picking up the phone, or a text message, or an email, or Zoom conversations, I think remain super important. Trust me, anything you're going through, probably somebody else is going through too. And just like in more typical times you would talk about it, so too should you do it now.
Thank you, Professor. And this is going to be the last question for you. You know, obviously there are so many people out there who are you know, who are worried about, you know, not only their health and that of their family, but they're worried about their future career prospects. They're worried about the long-lasting impact of this. So what just a general advice would you have to those of us who are you know, in business school during this very strange and weird time in world history?
Yeah, every stressful period like this is different, but I can tell you, watching this in the stock market crash of '87, the severe early '90s commercial recession, watching it through the tech meltdown, through 9/11 and accounting scandals, through the financial crisis, and this, economies snap but snap back. And I think the question is, again, resilience and preparedness as an individual, as well as an economy. I think you will find in the alumni population plenty of people who started out at some of those stressful times who've done very well. And I think one of the goals for us as a school community ought to be to come together, not just for each other now as students and faculty and staff, as we're doing, but alumni and people who are part of our community. Is it going to be easy? Of course it's not. But those recoveries are real, and they depend on our own agency.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Professor, for taking your time. I know that we all really appreciate it, and
My pleasure.
have been fantastic.
Well, it's great for me to have the last word over Joe Stiglitz too. So that to me is the thrill.
Well, I know that we're so happy to have both of you and glad that you could stick around till 1:30.
My pleasure.
So to the rest of the community, guys, thank you so much for being able to check in and listen in with us. I know that this is in Dean McGlaris's eyes, this is going to be the first of several conversations that the university is going to be having. I know that the next one is going to be Dean McGlaris's town hall. That's going to be on the 31st. So if you all would please check in for that. And I hope that this really was an opportunity for all of you to be able to come together and for us to be able to come together as a CBS community for the very first time, really since classes went online a few weeks ago. So thank you all so much. And I hope that all of you and your families are safe and healthy right now. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.